The geopolitical tectonic plates have shifted, and the epicenter is not in the Middle East or the South China Sea, but in the freezing waters of the North Atlantic. Welcome to the Geopolitic Ledger.
We are witnessing a moment in history that future historians will likely point to as the day the Western alliance cracked, perhaps irreparably. The headline numbers are staggering. A $1.7 trillion trade framework suspended, the NATO alliance brought to the very brink of dissolution, and a diplomatic standoff that turned allies into adversaries overnight.
It began with a proposition that sounded like a real estate mogul's fantasy, the purchase of Greenland, but it spiraled into a crisis that exposed the raw, exposed nerves of global hegemony.
The story we are covering today is not just about tariffs or territory. It is about the desperate scramble for the resources that will define the next century of technology and warfare. Before we unravel this complex web of diplomacy and economic warfare, I want to hear from you.
Do you believe that in the modern era, strategic territorial acquisition is a necessary move for superpowers? Or does it represent a dangerous return to 19th century imperialism? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I'll be reading through them after the video.
To understand the magnitude of this collapse, we first have to look at the immediate catalyst. The relationship between the United States and the European Union has long been the bedrock of the global economy, a partnership worth roughly $1.7 trillion annually in reciprocal trade. This exchange of goods, services, and investments is the engine that has driven Western prosperity since the end of the Cold War. However, that engine ground to a screeching halt following a series of escalations that few saw coming. The crisis stems from President Donald Trump's aggressive and singular pursuit of Greenland. For decades, Greenland was viewed largely through the lens of scientific research or as a quiet, icy outpost of the Kingdom of Denmark. But in the eyes of the current U.S. administration, the island represents something far more critical: survival. Greenland is not merely a mass of ice. Beneath its melting glaciers lies one of the world's largest untapped reserves of rare earth minerals: neodymium, dysprosium, and terbium. These are the elements that power everything from the guidance systems of F-35 fighter jets to the batteries of the electric vehicle revolution. Currently, China controls the vast majority of the global supply chain for these materials. Trump's logic was cold, transactional, and geostrategic. If the U.S. does not control Greenland, China eventually will. The conflict ignited when the White House made a formal, albeit unconventional, offer to purchase the island from Denmark. When the Danish Prime Minister rejected the offer, calling it absurd and reaffirming that Greenland is not for sale, the diplomatic tone shifted from transactional to threatening. The U.S. administration, leveraging its economic might, threatened to impose severe tariffs not just on Denmark but on key European sectors, while simultaneously hinting at a withdrawal of military support for NATO's northern flank. This was a direct challenge to Article 5 thinking, the idea that security guarantees are unconditional. Trump weaponized the security umbrella to force a real estate deal. The shockwaves in Brussels were immediate. The European Parliament, usually a body of slow deliberation, acted with surprising speed and ferocity. Viewing the threat against Denmark as a threat against the sovereignty of the entire bloc, the EU took the drastic step of freezing the Agreement on Reciprocal, Fair and Balanced Trade. This freeze was the economic equivalent of a nuclear option. The suspended deal was meant to harmonize regulatory standards and eliminate tariffs on industrial goods, a massive boon for both the American and European economies. By suspending it, Europe sent a message that it would not negotiate the territorial integrity of its member states under the barrel of an economic gun. The markets reacted instantly. Uncertainty rippled through the Frankfurt and New York stock exchanges. The prospect of a trade war between the two largest democratic economies in the world at a time when global growth was already slowing terrified investors. But beyond the economics, the political damage was profound. For the first time in decades, the leaders of Europe began to openly discuss the possibility of a future without American reliance. The Atlantic Bridge wasn't just shaking, it was burning.
The strategic importance of Greenland cannot be overstated, and this is why the U.S. was willing to risk so much. Beyond the rare earth minerals, the island sits at the precipice of the Arctic Circle.
As climate change accelerates the melting of polar ice, new shipping lanes are opening up, the Trans-Polar Sea Route, which could drastically reduce shipping times between Asia and Europe, bypassing traditional choke points like the Suez Canal. Whoever controls Greenland controls the gateway to these new routes. Furthermore, the island hosts Thule Air Base, the U.S. military's northernmost installation, critical for missile warning and space surveillance.
The fear in Washington was that a Greenland dependent on Beijing for investment could eventually restrict U.S. military operations, or worse, host Chinese dual-use facilities. This is the context of the Great Arctic Game, a shadow war for influence that turned the friendly relations between Washington and Copenhagen into a high-stakes standoff.
As the trade freeze began to bite, affecting industries ranging from German automobiles to American pharmaceuticals, the pressure to find a resolution became immense. The standoff moved to the snowy peaks of Davos, Switzerland, during the World Economic Forum. The atmosphere was reportedly icy, mirroring the geopolitical subject matter. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, a man known for his pragmatic approach to alliance management, found himself in the impossible position of mediating between the U.S. president and the furious European heads of state.
The alliance was effectively paralyzed. If Turkey or the Baltic states looked at this conflict, they saw a terrifying precedent. If the U.S. could threaten a loyal ally like Denmark over territory, what was the value of the security guarantee for the rest of them? The very credibility of the West was on the line in that conference room in Davos.
Now, if you are enjoying this deep dive into the hidden mechanics of global power, please consider subscribing to the Geopolitical Ledger. We break down the complex stories that the mainstream media often glosses over, giving you the historical and economic context you need to understand the world.
Your subscription helps us keep these investigations going. Now, back to the Davos Summit.
Inside the closed-door meetings at Davos, a compromise began to take shape, one that would be labeled the secret deal by insiders before its public unveiling. The reality was that neither side could afford a protracted economic war.
The U.S. economy, while robust, was sensitive to the loss of the European export market, and Europe, facing its own internal struggles and a war on its eastern border in Ukraine, could not afford to lose the U.S. security umbrella. The result was a classic piece of realpolitik. The agreement, officially termed the NATO Arctic Security Initiative, was a masterclass in face-saving diplomacy that fundamentally altered the status quo of the Arctic. Under the terms of this new framework, the United States agreed to a complete withdrawal of all tariff threats and reaffirmed its unconditional commitment to the defense of Denmark and Northern Europe. The suspended trade talks were quietly put back on the table, though with new tension in the air. In exchange, the U.S. secured what it really wanted, albeit without the flag-planting ownership it initially demanded. The initiative created a legal and logistical pathway for American companies, backed by the U.S. government, to develop rare earth mining infrastructure in Greenland. It also greenlit the expansion of missile defense facilities on the island. Crucially, this was framed not as a U.S. takeover, but as a NATO capability enhancement. The narrative was shifted from U.S. imperialism to alliance security. However, there was a catch, a safeguard inserted by European negotiators to protect Danish sovereignty. The United States did not gain ownership of the land. Access was granted strictly through the NATO partnership framework, and the local government of Greenland, along with Copenhagen, retained the right to veto specific projects if they were deemed environmentally catastrophic or socially destabilizing. This was the critical concession that allowed European leaders to sell the deal to their domestic audiences. They could claim they stood up to Trump and protected the territorial integrity of a member state, while Trump could return to Washington claiming he secured the strategic resources necessary to break China's stranglehold on the future of technology.
On the surface, it looked like a win-win, a de-escalation that restored order to the Western world. But if you look closer, the cracks in the foundation are visible. The secret deal may have stopped the trade war, but it validated a dangerous premise that alliance relationships are transactional. It proved that with enough pressure, the U.S. could force its way into strategic assets of sovereign allies.
The trust that defined the post-World War II order has been eroded. European nations are now accelerating their own strategic autonomy initiatives, looking to build defense capabilities that do not rely on Washington.
The psychological damage of the threat, the realization that the U.S. was willing to leverage NATO protection as a bargaining chip for resource acquisition, will not heal quickly. The ledger of trust has been overdrawn. And this brings us to the most uncomfortable conclusion of this entire saga. While Washington and Brussels were locked in this high-stakes diplomatic wrestling match, Beijing was watching. And in many ways, China is the true winner of this conflict. The public display of disunity within NATO is a propaganda victory for the Chinese Communist Party, which has long argued that the Western alliance system is archaic and unstable. While the US and Europe spent months bickering over Greenland, China continued to quietly expand its influence in the global south, solidify its supply chains in Africa, and advance its own Polar Silk Road ambitions with Russia. The internal fighting of the West distracts from the external rise of the East. The time and political capital spent repairing the damage of this dispute is time and capital not spent on countering the systemic challenges posed by authoritarian regimes. Furthermore, the NATO Arctic Security Initiative, while securing resources for the U.S., creates a new frontier of militarization in the Arctic. Russia, seeing this expansion of NATO infrastructure in Greenland, will likely respond with its own buildup in the region, leading to a security dilemma that makes the Arctic less stable, not more. The deal averted a trade war, but it may have started a Cold War in the high north. The scramble for resources is no longer a theoretical concept. It is the dominant driver of geopolitical friction. The breakdown of the $1.7 trillion trade deal was a warning shot, a preview of a world where economic interdependence is no longer a guarantee of peace, but a weapon to be wielded in the pursuit of national interest. As we look to the future, the question remains, can the Western alliance survive this shift toward transactional diplomacy, or have we witnessed the beginning of the end of the Atlantic era? The resources in Greenland will be mined, the missiles will be stationed, and the trade will flow. But the spirit of the alliance has changed. We are entering a colder, harder world, where the ledger of geopolitics is balanced not by shared values, but by raw assets and strategic leverage. We will continue to monitor the implementation of the Arctic Security Initiative and the European response in the coming months. If you found this analysis insightful, please hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We are building a community of critical thinkers here at the Geopolitical Ledger, and we want you to be a part of it. Thank you for watching, and we will see you in the next report.